Contractionary policy with respect to taxation would be increasing taxes for businesses and individuals. This would leave less money in their pockets, and that, as a result, would decrease consumption. And one of the goals, as you can see at the bottom here, the aims of fiscal policy is to change aggregate demand through the different components. Consumption is the primary component, making up about 68% of aggregate demand. Therefore, changing taxation would have a large impact on consumption by businesses and individuals. Therefore, that would contract the economy. If people had less money in their pockets for consumption, that would cause consumption to fall pretty dramatically. A decrease in taxation would be an expansionary policy because it would have the reverse effect. It would put more money into the hands of businesses and individuals. As a result, more money would be spent throughout the economy. That would increase consumption, increase aggregate demand. The second tool that the government has at their disposal is government spending. And this is government expenditures, not necessarily government purchases. Government purchases are contained within government expenditures, but this would definitely have an effect on the government purchases portion of aggregate demand. So contractionary policy would be if the government were to reduce the amount of spending, putting less money into the economy through the government expenditures, and contracting the economy through the element of aggregate demand, that is government purchases. An increase in government spending would be an expansionary policy for opposite reason. It would put more money into the economy, increase that aspect, the government purchases aspect of aggregate demand, and as a result, increase aggregate demand overall. Now, to go to the homework, we can start looking at the homework problems that discuss different aspects of fiscal policy. The first one, after September 11th, the federal government increased military spending on wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And is this increase considered fiscal policy? And in this case, no. This would be an increase in defense spending had to do with homeland security objectives, not necessarily the government trying to make changes in the economy. The difference between federal government purchases and federal government expenditures are that out of the larger category of government expenditures, government purchases are contained within it. This next gives us a table for a static aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And it asks us to identify what the results will be of different policies in terms of fiscal policy. So if the problem is a recession and the policy then is an expansionary policy, either the government will increase spending or lower taxes. Both are expansionary policies. And the goal of this policy is to raise GDP and the price level. Next, we're going to have rising inflation as the problem. And in this case, this is going to be contractionary policy. And so what are we going to do? They're going to either raise taxes or decrease government spending. And the effect this will have is that real GDP and price level will fall if that policy is followed and successful. Next, we're given the model, the aggregate demand, the aggregate supply model, and we're asked to determine which combination of fiscal policies is going to shift 81 to 82 in each of the two models. So what we can see here is in the first model, example A, we can see that curve shifts to the right. So that would be clearly an expansionary policy to get us there. And for example B, that curve shifts from 81 to 82 shifts to the left, and that's going to be a contractionary policy that gets us to that point. So we're going to just find the one that says expansionary policy for A, contractionary for B. Next, we have a similar model. It says if actual real GDP in 2006 it occurs at point B, so here's our point B, And potential GDP is here at long run aggregate supply, 06. We would expect the government to pursue what kind of fiscal policy? Well, if the actual GDP is greater than potential, we have what we call an inflationary gap. And that gap means that this increase in GDP above and beyond potential is going to put inflationary pressure on the economy. And in order to control for that, the fiscal policy that would be undertaken by the government in that moment would be contractionary. So they would want to implement policies that would lower actual GDP and all the things that go with it. So here we go. We're going to have actual real GDP then. What would happen is it would fall. That contractionary policy would bring it back. Potential real GDP would not change because that has to do with the factors that are available in the economy. The price level would fall. If we go from B to C, we can see that the price level would decrease and unemployment would increase. So inflationary gaps put contractionary policies in place to control that runaway inflation, and would have the following effects. The next one, a similar situation, but in this case, we're going to see, it says that suppose the economy is in equilibrium in the first period at point A. So let's find point A. In the second period, the economy reaches point B. And what would we expect the federal government to pursue, and what type of policy in order to move 82, which is right here, to point C, which is the 82 policy. So what kind of policy is going to get them from one point to the next? So in this case, it should be pretty easy to see that we're going to shift that to the right. So that's going to be expansionary policy. That's just going to get them there. And sorry, I'm reading pages. Here we go. And what will this do? Expansionary policy will increase actual GDP. It will not change the potential real GDP, so no change there. The price level using this policy would increase and unemployment would decrease. So these are two opposite policies intended to achieve opposite results. The figure to the right says, suppose that the economy is in equilibrium in the first period at point A. So we're doing that again. In the second period, the economy reaches point B. We saw that. What policy would the federal government likely pursue in order to move 82 to 82 policy and reach equilibrium point C? So we've just identified that exact scenario and said, well, it's going to be expansionary policy. And the government has two tools at their disposal that are expansionary. They can either, to expand and to grow the economy, they can either decrease taxes or increase government spending. So if we're looking for an expansionary policy, we can see that this wouldn't work. This wouldn't work. The only one that would work is to increase government spending. The next one says that one-time tax rebates, such as those in 2001 and 2008, increase consumption spending by less than a permanent tax cut because one-time tax rebates increase current income. So they only affect us right now. However, a lot of us make our consumption decisions based on what we see as our future income. And a permanent tax cut would affect our willingness to spend into the future, currently and in the future. So it's a little bit limited when it's just a one-time tax rebate because we don't count on it for future spending. The next one gives us a figure to consider and says an increase in government spending shifted the aggregate demand curve from 81 to 82. As a result, both price level and real GDP increased. What can be said, however, about the increase in real GDP? And this is asking us to look at what happened. So since they told us that the price level increased, we can assume that the movement was from A to C. So we look at each of these four options here, and we can see, well, it had increased by less than indicated by a multiplier with constant price level. And we can look at that. If we had a multiplier with a constant price level, it would have gone from A to B because the price didn't change. In this case, the price level increased and the distance from A to C is less than. So it was less of an increase than it would be had there been a constant price level. So that one's kind of one to look at graphically and understand. I just want to make sure I circled the correct answer and didn't say one thing and circle another. Okay. And this is, by the way, the explanation here. If you need to read it again or see it again, this is a little more thorough description of that. Next, as a result of crowding out in the short run, the effect on real GDP of an increase in government spending is often less than the increase in government spending. Because of that crowding out, by definition, it pushes private investors out. So the next one, does government spending ever reduce private spending? And yes, because that is what crowding out is the reduction in private spending as a result of government spending. How does a budget deficit act as an automatic stabilizer to reduce the severity of a recession? And what it does is all of the things you see here. Transfer payments to households increase during recession. And that's just defined as people that are eligible to receive them. They don't have to suddenly start changing the laws to have this happen. It's built into the structure of our welfare system. Consumers spend more than they would in the absence of social insurance programs. During recessions, tax obligations fall due to falling wages and profits. All of these things are true, and as a result, these are all automatic stabilizers that would occur during a recession. Number 13, or the next one, increased government debt can lead to higher interest rates and, as a result, crowding out of private investment spending. In terms of borrowing, which is debt spending, what will offset the effect of crowding out in the long run so that government debt poses less of a problem for the economy? And this one is going to be another all of the above, and here's why. Debt spending on highways and ports is going to occur. Debt spending on research and development will be part of that, and there will be debt spending on education. All of those will offset the effects of crowding out in the long run. Those are all public spending projects. When it is considered good policy for the government to run a budget deficit, or when is it considered good policy for the government to run a budget deficit? And it's when that borrowing is used for long-lived capital goods that are going to create infrastructure, for example. Social insurance programs, not necessarily a good way to run a long-term budget deficit, but a good policy is one that will lead to greater production in the future, and capital goods tend to have that effect. The next one says, a policy that is specifically designed to affect aggregate supply and increase incentives to work, save, and start a business by reducing the tax wedge is called. And that is our definition of supply-side economics. Next, what are the gains to be had from simplifying the tax code? And you could see that all of these things are true. Greater clarity of decisions made by households and firms, increased efficiency, and resources from tax preparation industry freed up for other endeavors. Next, assuming a fixed amount of taxes in a closed economy and that the marginal propensity to consume equals 0.90, calculate the value of the following multipliers. Be sure to use a negative sign to show if a multiplier has a negative value. So you can see that the answers are here, but let me just remind you of what these multipliers are. And I think this is worth noting and remembering, perhaps writing down a few times to make sure you commit it to memory. But here we go. The government purchases multiplier is the change in consumption over the change in government spending, government purchases. So in this case, it's 1 over 1 minus the MPC. So we're told in this particular instance that the marginal propensity to consume is 90.90, I should say. And so we're going to get 1 over 0.10 or 10. So the government purchases multiplier is 10 in this case. The tax multiplier, here's our calculation for it, is the change in consumption, or income I should say, over the change in taxation. So we're going to take our negative marginal propensity to consume divided by 1 minus MPC. So in this case, that becomes -9 if we run our numbers through. And the balanced budget multiplier is 1 minus MPC divided by 1 minus MPC. So it's going to equal 1. So just some multipliers to know the definitions of. The next one asks us to calculate the government purchases multiplier given some very specific information. So for that one, we're going to use this formula here. It's 1 over, and the bottom part of this fraction is 1 minus, and this is a bracket here, the MPC times 1 minus T, which is the rate of taxation, minus the marginal propensity to import. So we're given that information above, and we're just going to plug it into our fraction. We want to be careful and watch that our values are used correctly. And so here we go. It's going to be 1 minus, and then in brackets, 0.60, our marginal propensity to consume, times 1 minus T, which T is given to us as 0.20, so that's going to be 0.80. So, and let me take out that dot there. I think that might lead to more confusion than it does anything else. And then that value minus the marginal propensity to import, which is given to us as 0.10. So as we're solving this, it's important to remember that it's a fraction. So we're going to solve the bottom part first. So let's do 0.60 times 0.80 minus 10 as 1.10 as a value. And so you can see that that's going to come to, hang on a second. I'm going to go ahead and calculate this while I've got you here. Times 0.80 is 0.48 minus 0.10. So it's going to be 1 minus 0.38. And 1 minus 0.38 is 0.62. Now that's only part of what we need to know because it's a fraction. So 1 divided by 0.62 is going to give us 1.61. So it's important to know that that's our answer. Now, this one is different. I'm just looking at the value of the one that I had before. Okay, so that's the process by which you solve this. Just watch out for your multiplication and your solutions here. Remember your order of operations. You're going to take this times this, subtract that, and then subtract all of that from 1, and then divide 1 by that value. Next, use the line drawing tool. Show on the graph on the right the change in the aggregate demand curve that would result from a $5 billion increase in government purchases if the government purchases multiplier equals 2. And we're going to label that 82. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to move that curve to the right by $10 billion. 5 billion times 2. So you can just find a point and like 50 to 60, for example. And you'll just draw a new curve here, and that will be multiplier 2. And you'll have a line drawing tool that will help you with that. Now on the same graph, show the aggregate demand curve using the tool that would result from the same increase if the multiplier equals 4. So it's going to be 5 billion times 4. So it's going to be a $20 billion increase. And again, we can just move that from one point to another. You can pick a point and draw a curve there. So not too much trouble with that one. It's just recognizing graphically that shift. From an understanding of the multiplier process, explain why an increase in the tax rate would decrease the size of government purchases multiplier. And as we saw in that formula before, the value of the government purchases multiplier would decrease because the formula for the multiplier has us to multiply it by 1 minus the tax rate. So there is that decrease that is built into the multiplier. Similarly, explain why a decrease in the marginal propensity to import would increase the size of the government purchases multiplier. And it's because the value of the government purchases multiplier would decrease because the formula in the multiplier in the denominator is right here. So the smaller the number in a multiplier, the larger the multiplier. The smaller the number in the denominator of a fraction, the larger the total value. So just to keep that in mind, and you can run that through if you're not sure how that works, but I refer you back to this government purchases multiplier formula. So if the bottom part of the fraction is smaller, you're dividing by a smaller number, you're going to get a larger result. Okay, so that's the homework for this chapter. It's probably our last chapter, I believe it is, that we're going to be going over. So I wish you lots of luck, ask lots of questions, and be sure that if you're struggling with the concept that you try different versions so you can practice it and really get the hang of it.